Hello and welcome to Crosstalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. Is it for real this time? Moscow and Washington have announced the date for the end of hostilities of Syria's 5-year civil war, though the campaign against terrorist groups like ISIL and al-Nusra will continue. Putin has delivered. Can Obama? To Crosstalk the Truce in Syria, I'm joined by my guest, Philip Giraldi in Washington. He's a former CIA counterterrorism specialist who is now executive director of the Council for the National Interest and Rights for the American Conservative. Also in Washington, we have Gareth Porter. He's an independent investigative journalist and historian. And in Beirut, we cross to Sami Nader. He is a Middle East analyst. All right, gentlemen, Crosstalk rules in effect. That means you can jump in anytime you want, and I very much encourage it. Philip, if I can go to you first in Washington, D.C. Reactions to the truce for February 27th. I've looked at it. The range is from jubilation to deep depression. It's never going to work. Where do you stand?
Well, I think it's a positive step by any standards, but the fact is the devil will be in the details. There's going to be a problem in terms of defining who exactly constitutes a terrorist that can still be shot at. And I think there are major problems for the U.S. side in terms of getting Turkey and Saudi Arabia in particular to line up.
Okay. Gareth, I mean, Philip, as usual, got it. Probably hit a lot of nails all at the same time there. I agree with him. Let's take it apart first. Again, you know, the groups here. The devil is in the detail, because if you look at the communique that was issued by both the United States and Russia, it's a bit thin on the details of who is a terrorist, what is a terrorist group in Syria. Go ahead.
Well, you know, the most interesting thing about this agreement is that John Kerry a few days ago, a few days before that agreement, actually was saying that the Russians have to stop bombing or carrying out airstrikes against what he called legitimate opposition groups, or otherwise there can't be a ceasefire. Now, what has actually happened in this agreement is that the U.S. and Russia have agreed to map out precisely where al-Nusra Front occupies or has military forces in operation, and they have agreed that anybody who is in that sphere, in that area, and of course exactly what that means is yet to be announced, at least, maybe yet to be determined, but any other forces that are close enough to the al-Nusra forces that they can be considered to be co-located or commingled will be fair game for bombing by the Russian forces. And that's a very significant concession, at least compared with what Kerry had said previously.
Okay.
That means, and by the way, at the State Department briefing, the day the agreement was announced, the spokesman was really pushed very hard by reporters. Is it true that the forces of the so-called moderates, or the U.S.-supported forces in Syria, are commingled with al-Nusra Front? And he ultimately agreed. He admitted that they were indeed commingled in some cases, and he said that if they are, in fact, in the close proximity to al-Nusra Front, well, then that's going to send a signal that.
Okay, well, that is an important signal there.
It's a
very important signal. Yeah, Sami, Gareth brings up a very good point. I mean, on the 27th of this month, I mean, at 12 o'clock, if you're close to al-Nusra or ISIL, you're going to pay very dearly for it. Is this going to give these groups an initiative to separate themselves? Go ahead in Beirut.
Yeah, the problem is they are not part of the deal, and I don't know if the parties who are brokering the deal have enough leverage on al-Nusra and ISIL, and if we will not end up with more civilian killed. My main concern when it comes to this truce that it does not rely on any political settlement, and this makes it so fragile and so shaky. Look what happens 2 or 3 days ago in Homs. So it's an area controlled by the regime, and it has been targeted by a terrorist attack. This to say that any truce, any ceasefire is not sustainable unless it relies on a political settlement. And the problem today is there is no political settlement, and the political platform that should unite the different players is totally absent. And this makes the ceasefire very fragile, in my view.
Yeah, but Phil, if I go back to you in Washington, because so many people were looking for a political settlement first, then cessation of hostilities, that was the major stumbling block. Now when you reverse it here, you start building, possibly could start building some confidence with all the players on in this conflict here. And plus, and I want to go back to very importantly what you said about Turkey and Saudi Arabia, this is probably the best way to go, because it was really the political future of Syria that was the biggest stumbling block for everybody involved. Go ahead.
Yeah, I agree with you on that. Basically, the political solution has been the problem right from the beginning. Essentially, you still have a wide variety of opinions on the future of al-Assad, about what kind of government Syria might have. So, you know, the political problem has been the obstacle. I believe that the first step is to create a ceasefire. The next step is to create some kind of sustainable ceasefire, which might be more difficult. And from that point on, once you've succeeded in doing that and you've brought all the different credible groups around to the table, you can work on a political solution. I think that that very deliberately the U.S. government and the Russian government together have decided that the stability and the ceasefire are far more important as a first step.
Okay, Gareth, if I go back to you in Washington also, this is the political settlement, since it has been taken temporarily off the table here, I think the truce formula that has come up, the Americans and the Russians came up with, is actually a face-saving measure for the Saudis and the Turks here, because it doesn't deal with that, because that's the most important element for them, the outcome of this civil war. Once you take that off the board, the Americans are now saying to the Turks, get in line, and say the same thing to the Saudis. Do you think it's going to work? Go ahead.
On the question of whether it's going to work or not, I think it is going to have an effect. I think there will be some defections, if you will, of some of the U.S.-supported groups away from the al-Nusra Front alliances that they've had in the past. But I think that it's very difficult to predict what proportion of those groups will, in fact, leave the field of battle that they've occupied in the past with al-Nusra Front. And the most important armed groups clearly are going to continue to be al-Nusra Front and Ahrar al-Sham. They occupy a dominant position in the movement, the armed movement against the regime. And they, of course, have denounced the whole process of negotiations. They will have nothing to do with it anyway. So the war is going to continue, and the only question is whether this will have any effect at all on their calculations, combined with, of course, the continued military operations by Russian Air Force and the Syrians and Iranians.
Okay, Sami, there's some groups that have complained openly that call themselves opposition or rebels that the U.S. has let them down. Washington has let them down because they made a lot of promises, gave them a lot of guns, ammunitions, and who knows what else. And now they're changing policy, saying that they're betraying all the hard work and lives lost on their side for the past 5 years. How do you react to that?
I mean, the problem with the American policy, with the U.S. policy, that it has changed several times during the crisis. And this is one. I mean, it boils down, in my view, to one question. if you want to reach a sustainable truce in Syria. And this question is how you will get the Syrian Sunni on board. Because unless you have this major component of the Syrian society on board, there is no chance neither for a political settlement nor for, even a ceasefire or a truce. And you will have to deal with Saudi Arabia on one side and Turkey on the other side trying to sponsor this Sunni component. It's very essential to get the Sunni on board to make any truce sustainable, because if you are facing Sunni radicals with Shia or with Alawite or with Russian, American or any Western, this will deepen the crisis, and this will turn it in a crusade style of war. While what is required is fighting Daesh with Arab Syrian, with Sunni Syrian. So it boils down to this central question: how to get the Sunni on board and make them part of an effective war on terror.
Let me go back to Philip. Philip, if this is the way it will work, if this is going to pan out here, the U.S. has to tell Saudi Arabia and has to tell Turkey, Qatar to knock it off. Stop the funds, stop the arms, and stop the flow of people. That will make a significant impact on what's happening on the ground. Can Washington carry through in getting its regional allies to do that? Go ahead.
Well, in my opinion, it's going to be the most difficult part of the current arrangement. Turkey has more or less declared any Kurdish group, and that includes a number of them that are supported by the United States, to be terrorists, to be the enemy. So it'll be very interesting to see in the next few days if Turkey continues its attacks on the Kurds. And I suspect they will. Yeah. And I suspect the Saudis will probably give lip service and say, yeah, we'll go along with what Washington is recommending, but at the same time, it will clandestinely continue its support to the terrorist groups that Gareth was identifying. I think this is going to be the hardest part of getting this through and coming out to some successful solution at the other end. And I agree with Fadi that the issue of the Sunni divide is important too, but that's something down the road. That's something that can be worked on.
Okay, gentlemen, I'm going to jump in here. We're going to go to a short break, and after that short break, we'll continue our discussion on Syria. Stay with RT.
Here's what people have been saying about Redacted tonight.
Give it to us.
Redacted is full-on awesome. The only show I go out of my way to watch every week. It really packs a punch. Lee Camp is the John Oliver of RT America.
You guys do have the same accent.
Hey, we are apparently better than boobs.
Nothing's better than boobs.
You see, people you've never heard of love Redacted tonight. The president of the World Bank, though, hates it.
Yeah, he doesn't really have any taste.
Seriously, he sent us an email.
What do you think about sanctions?
Easy right or wrong, but I definitely think sanctions are better than conflict.
You don't perform for diplomatic reasons. You perform for humanitarian ways.
I'm talking obviously about Edward Snowden.
I believe he's a hero. I believe he's coming directly from his heart.
Welcome back to Crosstalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. To remind you, we're discussing the proposed truce to stop the Syrian civil war. Okay, Gareth, I'd like to go back to you. In this program already, I think we've heard twice the phrase lip service, and I'd like to explore that term with the truce that is being proposed by Washington and Moscow. It seems to me that if the Americans can't control their regional allies, the Americans can say, the Obama can say, well, we tried to work out some kind of deal, and on the Russian side, we'll say, well, Assad doesn't have anyone to talk to, and oh, by the way, we're winning this war. There can be a military solution. No one will say it because it's not diplomatic, but it's possible. Go ahead, Gareth.
Yeah, this is a situation where, it's clear the United States should recognize that its interests are very, very sharply at odds with its allies in at least a political sense, the Saudis, the Qataris, and the Turks. In fact, what has happened in the past, at least up until very recently, is that the Middle East Sunni allies of the United States have really called the tune. And the United States has gone along with the initiatives by its Middle Eastern partners. Now, I think that situation has fundamentally altered in the sense that the Russian intervention has created a new reality on the ground that the Obama administration has been forced to acknowledge, and it has clearly brought about a fundamental shift in U.S. diplomatic stance, which is really reflected in the agreement that they've reached for this partial ceasefire. And my real curiosity now is whether the Obama administration will follow up on its shift diplomatically with regard to the cooperation with Russia, and will in fact lay down the law in a much firmer fashion to the Saudis and the Qataris and the Turks. And I do believe that the possibility that the line of supply from the Turkish border to Aleppo can be effectively cut is going to make a huge difference in this regard. It's going to give the United States a very powerful tool in dealing with its Middle Eastern allies.
Sami, also one can look at this truce through the prism of saving face, because without this, if this truce does for some reason work out, which I think all of us have very strong doubts, the U.S. faces a very severe diplomatic defeat, because for 5 years they said this guy Assad has to go, and Barack Obama will leave office, and Assad will still be standing. I mean, this also is a prestige issue for the United States, and the way it's seen in the region by its regional allies. Go ahead.
Yeah, it's not only about face saving, it's also about the heritage of the Obama administration, especially when it comes to the Middle East, because one major, achievement, or what the President Obama regards as his achievement in foreign policy, is the opening up to Iran and signing the deal with Iran, and what was assigned as a diplomatic victory. However, this diplomatic victory, as perceived in the Arab world, paved the way for a lot of wars, either in Yemen or in Syria. And one has to keep in mind that there is a crisis overshadowing the crisis in Syria, which is the conflict between Iraq and the Arab states. And this is making the Saudi Arabia and Qatar and even Turkey so nervous about the situation in Syria, because what they fear is Syria falling in the hand or in the sphere of influence of Iran, and this is ceding to Iran a military victory. And this is something that should not be neglected when it comes to assess the real situation and the real stakes in Syria.
Philip, what is the United States trying to achieve here? Because, Syria is not a national interest, a serious national issue for the United States. It is for its allies here. And this is one of the things I think that Obama is looking at. It is a legacy issue here, because the U.S. policy has changed so many times, and nothing has worked except for this pouring in enormous amounts of weaponry and training and money into this conflict. conflict, that they really don't have anywhere else to go. I mean, I have to really wonder, and this is my own personal opinion here, but I have to wonder if Lavrov and Putin kind of had to explain to Obama and his people how they should really play this, because they don't have very many cards left. Go ahead, Philip.
Yeah, well, I mean, any country's foreign policy should be based on its interests. And in this case, I think the Obama people and also the Bush people before, because the pressure on Syria started back in 2004, they all had a simple view of what could be accomplished and why it should be done. And it was basically a humanitarian point of view, that essentially Assad was a brutal dictator, and for that reason he had to be removed. But that was divorced from any kind of real interest the United States might have. And I think it was a false construct. I think the fact is that the United States still has no interest in Syria, apart from the terrorist presence, which has been brought in or introduced through action by the United States. And I think that basically what Obama would like to do is kind of ride this one out. I hope I suspect he hopes that this will endure in a manner of speaking, and that when this all sort of blows up again, he'll be gone.
Yeah. Gareth, you know, things very rarely work out the way you expect, the law of unintended consequences. And I have already mentioned on this program that there are groups that have been supported and funded in a variety of ways by the CIA, the Pentagon, and other forces in the West. And they're disgruntled right now because any truce with the regime in Damascus is a huge defeat for these people here. And what I'm getting at is that, you know, these people are trained, they're motivated, and they're angry. I have to wonder when the blowback starts, because these people didn't get what they wanted, but they certainly have a lot of tools in their toolbox, if you know what I mean. Go ahead.
Yes, the law of blowback absolutely does apply in this situation. And this actually relates to a previous point that was raised by Sami about the changes, and this has been mentioned, I think, also by you, the changes that have taken place in the policy of the Obama administration over the years. You know, a large reason for that is that there are fundamental differences within the Obama administration about what should be done in Syria.
Yeah.
They have basically been so extreme that they have gotten into the press over and over again. We know that President Obama was fundamentally not just skeptical, but really did not want to get involved not only in boots on the ground in Syria, but even providing arms to the opposition, to the Assad regime. And the reason is that he knew about the law of blowback. He knew what had happened in the case of Afghanistan. We know that he specifically made that argument against those who were pushing for arming the opposition. And so he really was caving in various points along the last few years to those in his administration, including Hillary Clinton, who wanted to arm the opposition. And I think that accounts for, I mean, it's the internal politics of the administration and of the United States that account for this contradiction between what Obama knew and what actually happened in terms of U.S. policy.
You know, Sami, if I can go to you in Beirut, kind of echoing what Gareth just said there, I think that's where the Qataris and the Saudis and the Turks, that's how they looked at the Obama administration, is they saw so many cracks, so many contradictions and differences that they could go their own way without, you know, without really saying, well, we're not doing anything different. We've heard this from the State Department. We've heard this from the Pentagon. We've heard this from the National Security Council, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, you can take what you want. You can pull and interpret U.S. foreign policy any way you want, because it has been so different over the years.
Yeah, this is true. But however, the key question is that any settlement in Syria should not be perceived as a victory for Iran. This is very true when it comes to the Arab states, and it is also true when it comes to Israel. I have been looking at the Israeli press in the recent days, and there is always this concern that to beware that any settlement that could happen now with the regime achieving a victory, the Syrian regime achieving a substantial victory in the ground, that this could translate into a victory of Iran. Iran, and Iran having a direct contact through the Golan and holding a card to put pressure on Israel. So this is to say that you have some concern in the region, whether from the Arab state or from Israel, that any settlement in Syria could benefit to Iran.
Well, let me talk about one.
Sami, I have to cut in here.
Okay, I want to ask all three of you very quickly. Okay, all three of you. Philip first. This is something Washington, can they stomach seeing Russia win? Real quick.
I think in this case they can. I think there'll be ways that it'll be spun. So they're already saying here in the U.S. media that it was the leadership of Kerry and Obama that brought this about. Okay. So I would say the answer is, yeah, they can live with it.
Okay, Gareth, can they live with it? Go ahead, real quick. Then I want to go to Sami.
I think they can, and I just want to add that the whole line about the fear of Iran having some victory in Syria simply ignores the history of the last 10 years and more, which is that Iran has had a very close relationship with the Syrian regime for its own security reasons.
Okay, Sami, real quick, is it a victory for Moscow, a victory for Russian foreign policy in the Middle East? Real quick, we're out of time.
This could be, I mean, a victory for Moscow, but I doubt this will work if it does not rely on a political and sustainable settlement in Syria.
Okay. On that point, we've run out of time, gentlemen. Many thanks to my guests in Washington and in Beirut. And thanks to our viewers for watching us here at RT. See you next time. And remember, crosstalk rules. I love you.